a city surrounded by water on 3 sides, walls so thick that no army had ever broken through them. And behind those walls, over 500,000 people waking up each morning believing their world would last forever. This was Constantinople in the early 7th century, the beating heart of an empire that had already survived for centuries. But far beyond the horizon, forces were gathering that would test everything this civilization had built. The question was not whether pressure would come. The question was whether geography alone could determine who would survive it. If this kind of deep historical storytelling speaks to something inside of you, consider subscribing to Civilizations Under Pressure. There is much more to uncover together. In the year 600 AD, the Byzantine Empire stretched across vast territories. Its borders touched the edges of Italy in the west, reached deep into Egypt in the south, and extended toward the ancient lands of Persia in the east. At the center of this enormous realm sat Constantinople, a city unlike any other in the medieval world. Built on a peninsula where Europe nearly touched Asia, it commanded the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Every ship carrying grain from Egypt, every merchant vessel loaded with silk from the east, every fishing boat returning with the morning catch, all of them passed through waters controlled by this single city. For the common people living within its walls, daily life followed rhythms that had continued for generations. The city awoke before dawn. Bakers started their fires in the darkness, preparing bread for the thousands who would soon fill the streets. The smell of fresh loaves mixed with the salt air drifting up from the harbors. Fishermen who had departed in the night hours began returning with their catches, their small boats gliding past the massive chains that could be raised to block enemy fleets from entering the Golden Horn. These chains represented something important to every resident. They were a reminder that the sea itself served as a protective barrier, a wall made of water that no army could climb. Beyond the harbors, the great markets of Constantinople came alive as the sun rose higher. Merchants from dozens of distant lands gathered in covered bazaars where goods from 3 continents changed hands. Spices from India sat beside furs from the northern forests. Glassware from Syria rested on tables next to leather goods from North Africa. The empire's position at the crossroads of ancient trade routes meant that ordinary citizens had access to products that people in other parts of the world could barely imagine. A craftsman's wife shopping for her family might walk past stalls selling pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, luxuries that would have been impossible to find in the smaller cities of the Western kingdoms. The rhythm of commerce shaped the lives of countless families. Silk weavers worked in workshops passed down through generations, their fingers moving through patterns learned in childhood. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze into vessels that would be used in homes and churches across the empire. Potters shaped clay into amphorae for storing wine and oil. Each craft had its own district, its own traditions, its own pride. A family's trade was often its identity, connecting the living to ancestors who had practiced the same skills in the same streets for 100 years or more. Beyond the city walls, the countryside of Anatolia supported a different kind of life, but one equally tied to the land and its gifts. Small farming villages dotted the fertile valleys and coastal plains. Families worked plots that had been cultivated since ancient times, growing wheat, barley, olives, and grapes. The cycle of planting and harvest governed everything. Spring brought the anxiety of hoping for enough rain. Summer demanded long hours under the hot sun. Autumn offered the reward of gathering what the earth had provided. Winter allowed for rest, repair, and preparation for the cycle to begin again. These rural communities lived simply but not poorly. The empire's roads, inherited from Roman times, connected even remote villages to larger market towns. A farmer could load a cart with surplus grain or olive oil and travel to sell it, returning with coins to buy tools, cloth, or salt. The system worked because it had worked for so long. Roads meant trade, trade meant prosperity. Prosperity meant taxes flowing to Constantinople, which in turn paid for the soldiers who protected the roads. It was a circle that reinforced itself, generation after generation. Religion wove through every aspect of daily existence. Churches stood at the center of communities, both large and small. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was the most magnificent religious building in the Christian world, its massive dome seeming to float above the interior like heaven itself descending to earth. But faith was not only for grand cathedrals. Village churches served as gathering places where births were celebrated, marriages blessed, and the dead remembered. Monks in distant monasteries prayed for the empire and its people, their voices rising in chants that had remained unchanged for centuries. For ordinary people, the church calendar structured the year as much as the agricultural seasons did. Feast days brought communities together. Fasting periods reminded everyone of shared sacrifice. The faith promised that God watched over the empire, that Constantinople was protected by divine favor as much as by its walls and waters. Family life centered on the household. Multiple generations often lived under the same roof or in connected dwellings along the same narrow street. Grandparents helped raise children while parents worked. Children learned their future trades by watching and assisting their elders. Daughters learned domestic skills from their mothers and grandmothers. Sons followed fathers into workshops, fields, or fishing boats. Marriage was both a personal union and an economic arrangement, joining not just two individuals, but two families, and often two sets of professional connections. A baker's son marrying a grain merchant's daughter strengthened both families' positions in the endless web of urban commerce. The elderly held positions of respect. Their memories stretched back decades, connecting the present to a past that seemed stable and unchanging. They could remember prices from their youth, festivals from long ago, stories told by their own grandparents about times even further back. This sense of continuity was itself a kind of comfort. The world had always been this way. The empire had always stood. Constantinople had never fallen to any enemy. The walls had held against every threat. The sea had protected against every fleet. Why would tomorrow be any different from yesterday? Children played in the streets and squares, their games echoing off stone walls that had stood for centuries. They chased each other through market crowds, earned small coins by running errands, and gathered to watch street performers and arriving merchant caravans. Their world was bounded by what they could see, the familiar faces of neighbors, the known paths between home and market and church, the comforting sight of the great walls standing firm against the outside world. They did not know that the outside world was changing. They could not know that their parents' world and their grandparents' world was not, in fact, eternal. They simply lived, as children do, in an endless present that felt like it would last forever. Along the eastern frontiers, soldiers patrolled borders that had been contested for generations. The Persian Empire had long been Byzantium's great rival, and wars between them flared and faded like fevers. But for civilians far from the fighting, these conflicts were distant concerns, matters for emperors and generals to worry about. News of battles reached Constantinople weeks or months after they occurred. Victories were celebrated with processions. Defeats were mourned and then forgotten as daily life continued. The border was far away. The walls were close and strong. The sea was calm and generous. In the early 7th century, no one living in Constantinople could have predicted what the coming decades would bring. No farmer in Anatolia could have imagined that the roads connecting their village to the wider world would soon become dangerous. No merchant could have foreseen that the trade routes bringing wealth from east and west would be disrupted in ways never experienced before. No child playing in the shadow of the great walls could have known that they would grow old in a world transformed beyond recognition. But history rarely announces itself in advance. It arrives slowly at first, then all at once, sweeping away the old certainties and forcing survivors to build something new from what remains. The geography that had blessed Constantinople, its walls, Its waters, its position at the crossroads of continents, would soon be tested as never before. The first signs of trouble came not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation of disturbing news. Merchants returning from the eastern provinces spoke of unrest along the borders. Soldiers passing through on their way to distant garrisons carried worried expressions and spoke in hushed tones. Letters from family members in Syria and Egypt mentioned strange movements of armies, unfamiliar names, and growing uncertainty. For the people of Constantinople, these early warnings were easy to dismiss. The empire had faced threats before. The empire had always survived. Surely this time would be no different, but this time was different. In the years following 630 AD, a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed that stunned the ancient world. Within a single generation, armies carrying the banner of a new faith swept across territories that had been part of the Byzantine and Persian empires for centuries. Syria fell. Palestine fell. Egypt, the breadbasket that had fed Constantinople for hundreds of years, fell. The speed of these losses was almost impossible to comprehend. Cities that had stood as pillars of civilization since the time of Alexander the Great changed hands in months. Borders that had seemed permanent dissolved like morning mist. For civilians living through these events, the experience was one of mounting confusion and fear. In Constantinople, the markets began to change. Goods that had once arrived regularly from the east became scarce. Spices that had been common luxuries disappeared from merchant stalls. Silk became harder to obtain and far more expensive. The great trade networks that had connected the city to India, Persia, and beyond were disrupted, rerouted, or severed entirely. Merchants who had built their livelihoods on these connections found themselves struggling to adapt. Some sought new trading partners. Others watched their businesses slowly collapse. The grain supply became a source of deep anxiety. Egypt had provided the majority of Constantinople's food for centuries. Ships loaded with wheat had crossed the Mediterranean in great fleets, ensuring that the city's massive population could be fed. When Egypt fell to the Arab armies, this lifeline was cut. Suddenly, the empire had to find new sources of grain or face the prospect of famine. Prices rose sharply. Bread, the most basic necessity of daily life, became more expensive than anyone could remember. Families who had never worried about food began to ration their meals. The poor, who had always lived on the margins, faced genuine hunger. Refugees began arriving from the lost provinces. At first, they came in small groups. Families who had fled advancing armies, merchants who had abandoned their businesses, clergy who had escaped fallen cities. They brought with them stories that spread through Constantinople like wildfire, tales of chaos and displacement, accounts of communities scattered and families separated, descriptions of ancient cities under new rule, their churches converted to other purposes, their familiar rhythms of life transformed beyond recognition. These refugees were living proof that the world was changing, that the empire was shrinking, that the unthinkable was actually happening. As more refugees arrived, the city struggled to absorb them. Housing became scarce. Competition for work intensified. Longtime residents viewed the newcomers with a mixture of sympathy and resentment. The refugees spoke the same language and shared the same faith, but they were also competitors for limited resources in an increasingly strained economy. Tensions rose in crowded neighborhoods. The sense of community that had characterized Constantinople began to fray at the edges. In the Anatolian countryside, the changes were equally profound, but took different forms. Farming villages that had existed peacefully for generations now found themselves closer to the frontier than ever before. The border, once comfortably distant, crept closer with each passing year. Rumors of raids reached even remote communities. Farmers who had never thought about defense began to worry about whether their village might be targeted. Some families chose to abandon their lands entirely, packing what they could carry and moving westward toward the relative safety of the coast or the capital. Others stayed, either unable to leave or unwilling to surrender the land their ancestors had worked. The roads that had once been arteries of commerce became paths of uncertainty. Merchants traveling to market towns began to encounter checkpoints, delays, and dangers that had not existed before. Bandits, displaced soldiers, and desperate refugees made travel risky in ways that disrupted the entire economy. A farmer who could no longer safely transport his surplus to market had little reason to produce more than his family needed. The circle of trade, taxation, and military protection that had sustained the empire for centuries began to break down. Children born during the crisis years grew into adults who knew no other world. For them, the smaller empire was not a diminished version of something greater, but simply the reality in which they lived. They learned trades suited to the new economy. They married and raised families within the contracted boundaries of Byzantine civilization. They told their own children stories of the past, but those stories grew more distant with each generation. The empire of Justinian, which had briefly reconquered much of the old Roman Mediterranean, became a legend rather than a living memory. The new Byzantium was smaller, poorer, and more defensive, but it was also home. The Anatolian countryside stabilized over time, though never fully regained its former security. A new system of military agricultural districts emerged, where soldiers were given land in exchange for service. These soldier farmers had strong incentives to defend their own territories, creating a more resilient frontier than the old professional armies had provided. Villages that survived the initial chaos developed their own defenses, watchtowers, refuge sites in nearby hills, warning systems that allowed civilians to flee before raiders arrived. Life remained harder than it had been before the crisis, but it became sustainable. Constantinople itself emerged from the centuries of pressure transformed, but unbroken. The population had declined from its peak, but the city remained the largest and most sophisticated urban center in the Christian world. Its markets, though dealing in fewer exotic goods, continued to bustle with activity. Its churches continued to celebrate the ancient liturgies. Its scholars continued to preserve and copy the texts of classical antiquity. The knowledge that would later spark the Renaissance in Western Europe survived in Constantinople's libraries, precisely because the city's geography allowed it to endure when other centers of learning fell. The question that had haunted the darkest years, whether this civilization could survive, had been answered. It could survive. It did survive. Not unchanged, not undiminished, but alive. The Byzantine Empire would continue for another 7 centuries after the Arab conquests, outlasting the caliphate that had nearly destroyed it. Constantinople would remain unconquered until 1453, protected by the same walls and waters that had saved it in the 7th century. Geography, it turned out, could indeed determine endurance during long periods of imperial decline. Position mattered. Walls mattered. Access to the sea mattered. A city built in the right place could survive catastrophes that destroyed cities built in the wrong place. But geography alone tells only part of the story. The walls would have meant nothing without people willing to maintain and defend them. The harbors would have provided no benefit without fishermen, sailors, and merchants willing to use them. The true story of Constantinople's survival is not a story of stone and water, but of human beings, making daily choices to continue, to adapt, to hope. Parents teaching children, craftsmen perfecting their trades, farmers planting seeds despite uncertainty about the harvest, ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary persistence. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden in the long centuries of Byzantine endurance. Civilizations do not survive because of geography or walls or strategic position. They survive because people choose to keep them alive, one generation at a time, through all the pressures that history brings. If this story has given something to think about, consider leaving a thought in the comments below. What other civilizations faced similar tests of endurance? And if someone comes to mind who might appreciate this kind of reflection on the past, perhaps share this journey with them. History remembers the empires that fell, but sometimes the more remarkable story belongs to the places that simply refused to disappear.